Good morning, world historians. Dr. Smith here. Today I want to talk about Chapter 3 from Robert Marx, Origins of the Modern World, States, Empires, and the New World. The world of today is a world of borders. Some 200 sovereign nations are recognized today by the United Nations. In contrast to the early modern world, we're talking here between the 16th and late 18th centuries, which was still overwhelmingly dominated by a handful of continental empires. In addition to Spain, in the New World, the most important of these expanding territorial patchworks was, as you can see on this map, the Manchu or Qing Empire in China, which was actually the successor of the Ming Dynasty. Of course, during the Ming Dynasty, China expanded with the voyages of Cheng He. And after that period, China turned inwards, but again started to look out in the 17th century to places like Tibet and the western reaches of the Chinese Empire. During this time as well, the Russian Empire expanded tremendously. It was mostly a European empire at the beginning of this early modern period. By the end of the 18th century, it had reached out not only to the far reaches of Asia, but it actually crossed the Bering Straits into Alaska. So the Russian Empire was now sort of touching the Americas itself. And then the other three empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire in Iran or Persia, and the Mughal Empire, were all empires of the Muslim world. So this is just a reminder that even as the Spanish under Columbus and his successors, the conquistadors, reach out and expand the reach of Europe across the Atlantic, there is still a great deal of dynamism in the world, a great deal of polycentrism, to use Robert Marx's term, in the early modern world. But despite periods of vigorous growth, these great land empires that you can see on this map failed to cash in on the commercial revolution being led by Western Europe, which included the exploitation of New World resources. Although they still covered vast areas by the 18th century, the influence of these empires declined, with the commercial and military power of the Europeans rising by contrast. The growth of early modern Europe was driven by the Portuguese, who introduced armed trading into the Indian Ocean, and also by the Spaniards, whose discovery of silver in the Americas, places such as the Potosi, which was a huge silver mine, still mined in Bolivia, although now it's mostly lead. The silver itself has dried up, was feeding the insatiable world demand for silver, which was largely led by the Chinese. By around the 18th century, some 2/3 of global supply was coming from Spain's colonies in the New World, aided by Spain's conquest of the Philippines in 1571. Philippines was a kind of way station for the supply of American silver to China. But ultimately, the silver bonanza would decline, and with it, the fortunes of Spain in the New World would be eclipsed by the English, the French, and other colonizing Europeans. So the world we live in today, the modern world, is inescapably a product of the Columbian Exchange. So I want to finish off today just reflecting on the role of the Atlantic slave trade, which we're going to talk about more next week. Of course, the Atlantic slave trade, sometimes referred to as the triangle trade. This is a very simplified diagram, but I think it explains some of the dynamics that were at work in the early modern period. So, of course, you had the slave plantations in places like Haiti and Jamaica in the Caribbean, which produce basically raw agricultural material, particularly sugar, becomes the dominating commodity of the Caribbean in the Atlantic world. And this is processed into what we think of today as molasses, other byproducts. And all of this triangular trade would have taken place within the context of the mercantilist systems that were practiced by the British, the French, other imperial powers. So would try to control the flow of trade within their imperial borders, within the centers and peripheries of their empire. So out in the far reaches of the empire, you would have slaves growing sugar in places in the Caribbean. That molasses would then be exported to colonial North America, cities like Boston and Philadelphia, where in turn they would produce things like rum. Rum was, of course, an alcoholic beverage that was very popular in the 17th and 18th century, being produced by slave labor in the form of molasses that was then converted to rum. Also, manufactured goods such as weapons were manufactured in the American colonies, which then sent out slave ships across the ocean to Africa, where rum and weapons were traded for slaves who become, of course, the labor force for this triangular trade. And during the period from around 1500 to the abolition of the slave trade, early 19th century, somewhere in the region of 10 to 12 million African slaves are taken in the Middle Passage or taken in chains from their homeland, with obviously tremendous consequences for the population of the world. So one final illustration there of the Atlantic slave trade, showing where most of the slaves were actually brought from in the 18th and earlier centuries, from West Africa, from places like modern-day Nigeria, Ghana, the Gold Coast, as it was called, or the Ivory Coast. Another 30% would have been brought in from further south in Africa, places like Angola, and then only about 5% from the east coast of Africa. So obviously proximity, geography plays an important role in the destiny of the Atlantic slave trade. But note that the vast majority of African slaves in the Middle Passage end up in the Caribbean. About 60% of all slaves taken from Africa end up in the Caribbean, working in the sugar plantations, or about a third of them in Brazil, where coffee was also widely produced by slave labor. And then finally, only about 5% of all African slaves taken from their homelands during this period of the Atlantic slave trade end up in what we would now think of as the future United States. So although in America we tend to think of the slave trade and the institution of slavery from a very domestic lens, I think it's important to recognize the global dimensions of this trade, as well as the sufferings that it caused. So next week we'll talk a little bit more about the slave trade and relate it to the foundations of the Industrial Revolution. So until then, have a good week, everyone, and I will talk to you soon.